He didn't ask for trouble. He was just a man with grease under his fingernails and a daughter waiting at home. But the moment that bully put his hands on Ethan Calloway inside a crowded Chicago cafe, in front of witnesses, in front of cameras, and in front of a woman who controlled more power than anyone in that room could imagine, something ancient and dangerous woke up behind those quiet eyes. The men who once feared his name in classified briefings knew what that stillness meant. Everyone else was about to find out. If this is your first time here, welcome. And if you've been with us a while, you already know we don't do ordinary stories on this channel. We tell the ones that stay with you. Before we go any further, do us a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what comes next, because we drop new stories every week, and you do not want to be the last one to hear them. Tap the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment below telling us what city and country you're watching from. We genuinely read every single one, and there is nothing quite like seeing how far these stories travel. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while, and every minute is worth it. The cafe was called Linden and Sons, and it had been on the corner of West Hubbard and North Halsted for going on 32 years. It was the kind of place that didn't bother with interior designers or Instagram aesthetics. Just dark wood tables worn smooth by 1,000 elbows, the smell of burnt coffee permanently soaked into the walls, and a chalkboard menu that hadn't changed its font since the early 90s. The regulars came because the coffee was honest and nobody bothered them. The newcomers came because their phones told them it was charming. On a Tuesday morning in late October, with a cold front pushing down from Lake Michigan and rattling the cafe's old front windows, Ethan Calloway sat at his usual table in the back corner with a cup of black coffee and his daughter's permission slip for a school field trip to the Natural History Museum. He was trying to read it. He had already read it 4 times. The problem wasn't the form. The problem was that his brain, the same brain that had once managed simultaneous threat assessments across 3 active engagement zones while operating behind enemy lines, could not seem to process one simple line of text. Please list any food allergies or dietary restrictions for your child. Ava didn't have any. He knew that. He'd known that for 11 years. But he kept reading the line and he kept not signing the form, because signing the form meant she was old enough to go on field trips without him. And that thought, somehow, at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning, was the most difficult thing he'd encountered in recent memory. He set the pen down, picked up the coffee, looked out the window at the people on the sidewalk moving fast with their heads tucked against the wind. Ethan Calloway was 37 years old. He was 6'1" and lean in the way that people who have spent real time in difficult places tend to be lean. Not gym lean, but the kind of lean that comes from years of carrying weight across distances most people couldn't imagine. He had a jaw that needed shaving more often than he got around to it, and dark brown eyes that tended to rest on whatever was in front of him, with a steadiness that some people found reassuring and others found quietly unnerving. He wore a flannel shirt and worn work boots. There was a smear of grease near his left wrist from a transmission job he'd finished the night before. He ran Calloway Towing and Repair out of a 2-bay garage on North Elston. He'd had the business for 6 years. Before that, he'd had a career that no one who knew him now would have guessed existed, and he preferred to keep it that way. His wife, Rachel, had died 5 years ago. Ovarian cancer, fast and brutal, from diagnosis to the end in 8 months. Ava had been 6. Ethan had been in the middle of a deployment he couldn't legally discuss when he got the call that Rachel's condition had turned, and he'd come home in 48 hours on emergency leave and never gone back. He'd submitted his paperwork, cleared his clearances, and walked away from a career that had defined him for 12 years without a single conversation with anyone about whether that was the right call. It was the only call. He picked up the pen again and signed the field trip form. That was when the door opened and Marcus Hale walked in. What? Ethan didn't know the man's name yet. He just noticed him the way he noticed most things, without appearing to, from the corner of his eye, while looking somewhere else entirely. Late 40s, broad across the shoulders but soft around the middle. Expensive coat, the kind with the logo on the chest that announced exactly what it cost. 2 men with him, younger, both looking at their phones. Hale moved through the cafe like the space owed him something, cutting around a woman carrying 2 drinks without slowing down or acknowledging her when she stumbled. The woman caught herself. Hale didn't look back. He went to the counter and started talking. Ethan couldn't hear the words, but the posture said everything. Arms spread, chin up, the voice pitched just loud enough that the surrounding tables could catch pieces of it. The young woman behind the counter, a college-age kid with her hair pulled back and a little enamel pin on her apron that said she, her, was nodding rapidly and looking at the register with the expression of someone trying very hard not to let their face say what their face was saying. "Don't care what the machine says. I'm telling you, I was charged twice." Ethan could hear it now. The cafe had gone quieter without him noticing, the way rooms do when someone raises their voice to a frequency that makes the hairs on the back of the neck stand up. "Sir, I can check the system, but if you have the receipt—" "I don't need a receipt. I need you to fix it." The girl pulled up something on the screen. Her hands were moving a little fast, the kind of fast that happens when you're nervous and trying not to show it. "Okay, so I'm looking at the transaction and it shows one charge for—" "Look, I don't have time for this." Hale turned to his two companions with a short, dismissive laugh. "You believe this?" The companions didn't say anything, but they smiled, which was enough. Ethan took a sip of his coffee. The girl behind the counter, her name tag said Priya, tried again. "Sir, I really do want to help, but the system is showing a single charge. If you can show me your bank—" "You calling me a liar?" Priya's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Because that's what it sounds like. I come in here, I pay for my order, I get charged twice, I tell you about it, and instead of just fixing the problem, you're telling me to prove it." Hale leaned forward against the counter. "Do you know who I am?" Ethan set down his pen. The cafe was fully quiet now, 12, maybe 14 people, and none of them were looking directly at the counter, but all of them were watching. The silent, cellular watching that happens in public spaces when something turns wrong. When everyone hopes someone else will say something first. Priya said, very carefully, I'm sorry, sir. I can get my manager." "Get your manager." "Sure. Get everyone. Maybe they can explain why their staff is incompetent." Ethan stood up. He did it slowly, the way he did most things. He pushed his chair back, folded the field trip form, put it in his shirt pocket, picked up his coffee, and walked toward the counter. He wasn't in a hurry. He moved through the tables without bumping anything. He stopped about 4 feet from Hale, slightly to the side, and said, "Hey." Hale turned. The two companions looked up from their phones. Ethan looked at Priya first. "You good?" She blinked. Yeah, I'm just—" "Take a second." He said it the same way he'd said hey, not unkind, not loud, just a voice that had spent years being the voice that other voices listened to in situations where listening mattered. Then he looked at Hale. Hale looked back at him. Took in the flannel shirt, the work boots, the grease near the wrist. "This got nothing to do with you, pal." "Maybe not," Ethan said, "but she's trying to help you, and you're making it harder than it needs to be." Hale's eyes narrowed slightly. "Who are you?" "Just a customer." "Then mind your business." Ethan didn't say anything to that. He just stood there, which, it turned out, was the thing that Hale found most irritating. "You hear me? Walk away." "I'm good here," Ethan said. One of the companions laughed, short, dismissive. Hale's jaw worked for a moment, and then something shifted in his face. The calculation that bullies make when an audience is watching and backing down feels like losing. He stepped toward Ethan. Not a swing, not yet, just the step. The invasion of space, the chest coming forward, the physical language that says I am bigger and I am not afraid of you and you should be afraid of me. And then he shoved him. Both hands, flat against Ethan's chest. Hard enough that a smaller man, or a man who wasn't expecting it, might have stumbled back into a table. Ethan didn't stumble. He absorbed the push the way a wall absorbs a knock. No give, no reaction. He just looked at Hale. The cafe went completely, absolutely silent. Not the polite silence of people trying not to stare. The deep silence of people who have just watched something cross a line and are now waiting, with held breath, to see what happens next. Hale realized, one breath too late, that something was wrong. It wasn't what Ethan said. He hadn't said anything. It was the way he was standing, completely still, completely calm, with his coffee still in his hand like the shove had been a change in wind direction and nothing more. His eyes were on Hale, and they hadn't changed. No anger, no fear, no adrenaline flush. Just attention. The specific kind of attention that belongs to people who have spent time in places where inattention gets people killed. The two companions had gone quiet. Priya was very still behind the counter, and then the front door of Linden and Sons opened again, and a woman walked in. Sienna Sterling was not supposed to be at this cafe. She was supposed to be in a car on her way to a 9 o'clock meeting at the Sterling Dynamics headquarters building on South Wacker Drive, where 17 items on the agenda were waiting for her signature, and her chief operating officer was going to spend 45 minutes pretending the third quarter numbers were a temporary fluctuation. She had known for 3 months that the numbers were not a temporary fluctuation. She had also known for 3 months that the problem was inside the company, not outside it, and that she had not yet figured out who. She had stopped at Linden and Sons because her driver had taken a detour around a water main break, and she'd told him to pull over because she'd caught the smell of real coffee through the car window, and she'd been running on convenience store espresso since 6 that morning. And sometimes, even when you're the CEO of a $2.4 billion company, you stop for the coffee. She was 30 years old. She had the kind of face that photographs well regardless of lighting, which was useful given how often her face appeared in business publications, but which she herself had never paid much attention to. She was wearing a dark gray coat over a fitted blazer, her hair pulled back at the neck, small pearl earrings. She looked, to anyone who didn't know her, like a successful young professional. She walked in and immediately read the room. That was something she'd always been able to do. Not the social reading of moods and interpersonal dynamics, which she was honestly mediocre at, but the structural reading of situations. Who was in what position, what the tension lines were, what was about to happen versus what had just happened. She'd been doing it since she was a kid, growing up in a house where you needed to know which version of her father was going to be in the kitchen before you walked downstairs. She saw the man in the flannel shirt first, because he was the still point in the room. Then she saw the man in the expensive coat, who was approximately 3 seconds into the realization that he'd made a serious miscalculation. Then she saw the 2 men behind him, both of whom were now looking at their feet. She got in line behind 2 other customers, because the coffee was still why she was here, and she watched. Marcus Hale had made a lot of money doing things that skirted the visible edges of legal. He ran a private commercial real estate development company, Hale Group Ventures, that specialized in acquiring distressed properties through a labyrinth of holding companies and subsidiary funds that kept his name at arm's length from most of the transactions. He was not a brave man. He was a man who had learned to mistake uncontested dominance for bravery, which is a mistake that tends to go unnoticed until it is suddenly, publicly, catastrophically corrected. He looked at Ethan Callaway and understood, in a way he couldn't quite articulate, that the correction was happening right now. "You need to step back," Ethan said. Not loud, not aggressive, just a fact, stated plainly. Hale's jaw tightened. Behind him, his companions were having a quiet, wordless conversation about whether they were going to be needed for something. Neither of them looked enthusiastic. "I push you and you just stand there," Hale said. It came out more like a question than he'd intended. "Yeah. Who are you?" "I said," Ethan repeated, with the patience of someone who has said the same words in much worse places, "step back." Hale laughed, short, a little sharp at the edges. "Or what?" Ethan looked at him for a moment. Then he set his coffee down on the nearest table and turned back to Hale, hands loose at his sides. "Or I'll ask you again," he said, "and then I'll stop asking." Something in Hale's chest contracted. He didn't know why. There was no threat in the words, no posturing, no escalation, just a man in a flannel shirt telling him, with the mild certainty of someone reading a weather forecast, exactly how the next several minutes were going to go. Hale took a step back. It wasn't a decision, it was a reflex. His body understood something his ego hadn't caught up to yet. Ethan turned back to the counter. "You need anything else from me?" he said to Priya. She shook her head. Her eyes were wide. "No, thank you." "All right." He picked up his coffee. He went back to his table. The cafe let out its breath. Sienna ordered a medium black coffee and stood near the pickup counter and watched the man in the flannel shirt sit back down and unfold a piece of paper from his shirt pocket and look at it with the same attention he'd just given the situation at the counter. Quiet, steady, fully present. He didn't look around the room to see who had noticed. He didn't seem to care. He put his pen to the paper. She took her coffee when it came and found herself walking past the tables toward the back of the cafe, which was strange because her car was waiting outside. She stopped at a table near his, not his table, the one beside it. She sat down. She didn't look at him. She took out her phone and pulled up the briefing notes for the 9 o'clock meeting because she had 40 minutes and 17 items, and she was still a CEO regardless of what was happening in the back of a coffee shop in River North. She read 3 lines of the briefing notes. Then she said, without looking up, "That was either very brave or very stupid." Ethan didn't look up from his form either. Leaning toward stupid, probably. He could have had a weapon. He didn't. She looked at him now. "You knew that?" He glanced at her. "Pretty sure." Sienna studied him for a moment. The coffee was good. Dark and clean, no bitterness. Outside, the wind pushed a paper cup down the sidewalk. "How?" she said. Ethan considered the question, which she appreciated. Most people either deflected or performed. "The way he moved," he said finally, "where his hands went when he got nervous. People carrying tend to check the weight. Even when they're not thinking about it, they check." He went back to the form. He wasn't carrying. Sienna looked at him for another second. Then she said, "What do you do?" "Towing, mechanic work." She nodded slowly. "That wasn't towing or mechanic work." He half smiled without looking up. "No, it wasn't." She almost left it at that. She was good at leaving things alone when instinct said, "Don't pull this thread." But something about the quietness of the man beside her, the complete absence of performance in everything he'd done in the last 15 minutes, made her say, "Who were you before?" The question landed differently than she'd expected. Not badly. It didn't seem to upset him, but it landed with a weight she hadn't entirely intended. He looked at her properly for the first time. "Someone else," he said. His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, and something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, but clearly, softened. "Sorry," he said, picking it up. "My daughter." He read the text and typed something back, quickly, the way parents do when a kid sends a message during school hours and you want to respond before the phone gets taken. Then he set it back down. Sienna watched him do it. She had built a company by learning which details mattered and which ones were decoration. That detail, the speed of the response, the small change in his expression when he'd seen who it was not decoration. "How old?" she said. 11. "Just you?" "Just us," he said. She nodded, looked at her coffee. Outside, her driver texted her asking if she needed more time. She typed back, 5 minutes. She stood up, gathered her coat. "For what it's worth," she said, "I thought it was brave." He looked up. It was a Tuesday morning in a coffee shop. The bar for bravery is probably somewhere higher. She smiled, a real one, not the boardroom version. "You'd be surprised." She walked out into the cold, got in the car, and sat with the briefing notes open on her lap for the entire ride to South Walker Drive without reading a single word. Ethan sat in the back of the cafe for another 20 minutes. He finished his coffee. He watched Priya remake 2 drinks she'd gotten wrong and laugh about it with the other barista. The tension of the morning already metabolized into something small and survivable, the way it tends to when the immediate danger is gone. He left a tip that was probably too large and drove his truck back to the garage on North Elston. He had a 2019 Ram 1500 coming in at 10 for a clutch replacement and an old Lincoln Continental whose owner swore the transmission was possessed. He had paperwork that was 3 weeks behind and an invoice he'd been avoiding sending because the customer was a retired high school teacher who he knew was on a fixed income and he hadn't figured out what to charge her yet. He had Ava's soccer practice at 4:30, which he would not be late for. He had not once been late for soccer practice. He put on the radio, a country station playing something he half recognized. He slid under the Ram and found the problem in the first 10 minutes because he'd done enough of them that his hands knew before his brain did. He was halfway through the job when his phone buzzed again. He wiped his hands and looked. Unknown number, Chicago area code. He almost didn't answer. He usually didn't with unknown numbers. Something made him answer. "Yeah." A pause. Then a voice. The voice from the cafe. He knew it immediately, though he couldn't have said how he was so certain. "Mr. Calloway?" Not a question. She'd already found his name. "My name is Sienna Sterling. I'm the CEO of Sterling Dynamics." Another pause. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand that this isn't a joke, and it isn't some kind of test. This is a real situation that has become complicated. Ethan was quiet for a moment. How'd you get this number? He said. The cafe has a community board. You have a card on it. A beat. I took a picture. He remembered. He'd put that card up 3 years ago and forgotten about it. What do you need, Ms. Sterling? She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness there was something that he recognized from a long time ago. The particular quality of someone who has just understood that the situation they're in is larger and more dangerous than they'd previously allowed themselves to believe. I found something, she said, inside my own company. Something that, if I'm right about what it means, I don't know who I can trust. I don't know who's clean. A pause. I think I need someone who is very good at staying calm. And at the moment, you're the only person I can think of. Ethan stared at the undercarriage of the Ram. I'm a tow truck driver, he said. I know what you told me, she said. That's not what I saw. He didn't respond to that. I'm not asking you to do anything dangerous, she said. She stopped, restarted. I need someone in my corner who doesn't have a reason to be lying to me. And right now, a stranger from a coffee shop is the best option I've got. Ethan put his hand flat on the cold concrete floor of the garage and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. He thought about Ava at school. He thought about soccer practice at 4:30. Where are you? He said. She told him. He pulled himself out from under the truck, cleaned his hands, and said, I'll be there in 30 minutes. He didn't ask himself why. He already knew why. The same way he'd known that Hale wasn't carrying, and the same way he'd known, sitting in the back of a cafe watching a woman read a briefing document she wasn't actually reading, that whatever was happening in her world was something that wasn't going to leave her alone simply because she was trying to outwork it. Some things follow you no matter how fast you move. He'd learned that the hard way. He locked the garage, left a note for the Lincoln Continental's owner, and got in his truck. The Sterling Dynamics building on South Wacker Drive was the kind of structure that announced itself before you arrived. 44 floors of glass and steel that caught the light off the Chicago River and threw it back at you in pieces. Ethan had driven past it 100 times without thinking about it. Buildings like that existed in a different layer of the city than the one he operated in, the same way certain frequencies exist on a radio dial you never tune to. He pulled his truck into the visitor parking structure and sat for a moment before getting out. The truck smelled like motor oil and the fast food bag Ava had left on the floor 2 days ago that he kept meaning to throw away. He looked at his hands. He'd cleaned them, but the knuckles still had that permanent faint gray of someone who works with metal for a living, the kind that soap and water manage but never fully correct. He got out. The lobby was marble and climate-controlled and staffed by a security desk manned by 2 men in blazers who looked up when he walked in. He gave his name. One of them made a call. The other watched him in the way that people in lobbies watch someone who doesn't match the expected profile of their building. Not hostile, just alert. 2 minutes later, a young woman in a dark blazer appeared from the elevator bank and introduced herself as Maya, Ms. Sterling's executive assistant. She had the polished, calibrated composure of someone who handled impossible things on a daily basis and had decided years ago that visible stress was a luxury she couldn't afford. She walked him to the elevator without asking questions. In the elevator, she said, She's in the private conference room on 38, not her office. Ethan noted that. Is that unusual? Maya kept her eyes on the floor numbers. Everything about today is unusual. He didn't push it. The 38th floor had the kind of quiet that money buys. Thick carpet, no overhead fluorescence, the low hum of an HVAC system that was expensive enough to be nearly inaudible. Maya led him down a corridor and stopped at a door that looked identical to the 3 beside it, tapped twice, and opened it without waiting for a response. Sienna was standing at the window with her arms crossed and a half-empty coffee cup on the table behind her, looking at the river below with the concentrated expression of someone working through a problem by staring at something unrelated to it. She turned when the door opened. Her eyes went to Ethan, and something in her posture shifted. Not relief exactly, more like the slight release of a pressure valve. You came, she said. Said I would. Maya pulled the door shut behind her, and they were alone. The conference room had a long oval table, 8 chairs, and a wall-mounted screen that was currently dark. Sienna had spread documents across one end of the table, not printed reports or formatted presentations, but handwritten notes on legal pads, photographs printed on plain paper, and what looked like screenshotted spreadsheet data. The organized chaos of someone who had been working fast and alone. Ethan stood at the edge of the table and looked at it without touching anything. "Start at the beginning," he said. She pulled out a chair and sat down, not at the head of the table but in the middle, which he read as deliberate. She was not performing authority right now. She was talking to someone she needed to actually hear her. He sat across from her. "Sterling Dynamics was founded by my grandfather," she said. 80 years ago, started as a regional logistics company. My father built it into an infrastructure and security services firm. I took over 6 years ago when he had his first stroke." She said this factually, no sentiment attached. "We have contracts with 7 state governments, 4 federal agencies, and over 200 private sector clients. Revenue last year was $2.4 billion. "I know what the company is," Ethan said. "What happened?" She looked at him for a second. Then she opened a folder and pushed a stack of papers across the table. 4 years ago, the board recommended we acquire a private security company called Meridian Consolidated Group. Meridian handled personnel vetting, executive protection, and facility security for a handful of mid-sized corporations. The board said it was a natural extension of our infrastructure services division. She paused. "I approved the acquisition." Ethan looked at the papers without picking them up yet. "Someone warned you not to," he said. The pause that followed was brief. One beat too long to be nothing. "There was an anonymous communication," she said carefully, "before the acquisition closed. It came through a third-party channel, a compliance tip line we maintain for employee concerns. The message said Meridian had ties to a criminal network that used corporate security contracts as a framework for money movement and asset diversion." She folded her hands on the table. "It was vague, no specifics, no documentation, just a warning. And you didn't act on it. I had the board's due diligence report. I had Meridian's financials. I had 2 independent audits." Her jaw tightened slightly. "And I had a growth target I was trying to hit by year end because the board was pressuring me, and I had something to prove, and I—" She stopped. "I decided the anonymous tip was either wrong or was being sent by a competitor trying to block the deal." "Was it?" She met his eyes. "No." He picked up the first page of documents. It was a spreadsheet printout, vendor codes, transaction amounts, account routing numbers, with certain rows highlighted in yellow. "What am I looking at?" he said. "Meridian's operations were folded into our security services division after acquisition. They brought their existing contracts, their personnel, their systems. For 3 years, everything looked normal. Revenues tracked. Audits were clean." She reached across and pointed to a column of numbers. "Last month, our CFO submitted our annual infrastructure review to the board. Routine. But there was a discrepancy in the contract reconciliation data, a gap between reported vendor payments and actual bank records. Small enough that it got flagged as a likely accounting error." She sat back. "Our CFO told me it was nothing. He'd handle it. We'd move on." "But you looked anyway," Ethan said. "I always look." No apology in it, just fact. "What I found was a network of fraudulent vendor contracts. 17 entities listed as subcontractors in our logistics and security divisions that don't exist. Shell companies. Over a period of 4 years, payments to these entities total—" She paused, and the pause wasn't for effect. It was because the number still hit her differently every time she said it. $640 million. The room was quiet for a moment. Ethan set the page down. "Who knows you found this?" "Me. My personal attorney, Claire Navarro. She's worked with my family for 15 years. And now you." "Not your CFO?" "No. Not the board. Especially not the board." She stood up and moved to the window again, not because she needed to see the river, but because she needed to move. "Graham Weston is the board chairman. He's been with the company for 22 years. He was my father's closest business partner. He was the one who recommended the Meridian acquisition." She turned around. 3 of the shell companies have their registered agent addresses connected to holding entities that trace back to properties managed by a subsidiary of Weston's personal investment group. Ethan looked at her. "He's been doing it through Meridian," she said, "using our security infrastructure, our vendor systems, our contract approval channels as a pipeline. And he's been doing it for 4 years, right underneath me." The last 3 words landed hard. She knew it. and she let them. "Where's the evidence you're describing right now?" Ethan said. "Some of it's here," she gestured at the table. "The rest is in our internal system. But Meridian's people control the server access protocols for 2 of our 3 data centers. If someone tipped Weston off before I could secure the records, they'd disappear," Ethan said. "Everything above a certain tier of access can be wiped in under 4 hours. The backup architecture was part of what Meridian brought over." She said it with the flat, controlled voice of someone describing their own house burning down. "I gave them the keys without knowing what they were going to do with them." Ethan sat with that for a moment. "What do you need from me?" he said. "I need to get to the evidence before Weston does. There's a secondary archive, a cold storage backup of all vendor contract data, housed in a logistics center in Cicero that our company leases but hasn't actively used in 2 years. Meridian's people don't know it exists because it predates the acquisition. The data there isn't mirrored through their systems." She came back to the table. "But I can't go there alone. And the only people I trust inside this company right now are Claire, who is 58 and has a bad hip, and my executive assistant, who I'm not putting in danger." "So you called a stranger from a coffee shop," Ethan said. "I called someone who, in the space of about 4 minutes this morning, assessed a threat, de-escalated it without ego, recognized what he was actually dealing with, and walked away from it without needing anyone to notice." She held his gaze. "I don't know what you used to do. I don't need to know. But whoever you used to be, that's who I need right now." Ethan looked at the papers on the table. He thought briefly and precisely about Ava. Soccer practice at 4:30. The field trip form now signed, sitting in his shirt pocket. He thought about the phone call he'd made from the parking structure before coming upstairs. Not to Sienna's office, but to his neighbor, Mrs. Pacheco, who was retired and liked Ava and had a key to the house. He told Mrs. Pacheco he might need her to cover pickup today. Mrs. Pacheco had said of course without asking questions because she was 81 and had raised 4 kids and understood that sometimes of course was the right answer. He'd made that call before he came upstairs. He'd known, somewhere between the parking structure and the lobby, that this was going to require more than a conversation. "When do you need to go?" he said. "Tonight," Sienna said. "The longer we wait, the more likely someone notices I've been pulling records and tells Weston." "Who else knows about the logistics center?" "Claire. She used to manage the lease documentation." Sienna hesitated. "She's meeting us there. I didn't want to talk in the building any more than necessary." Ethan nodded slowly. He looked at the window, at the gray October sky pressing down over the river. "One thing, he said. "What?" "If I find out you're not telling me something, anything, I walk. No argument, no negotiation. You tell me everything or you tell me nothing and find someone else." She didn't hesitate. "Agreed. And I need to make one stop before we go," he said. 20 minutes. "Where?" "My garage," he said. "I have a few things there I should probably bring." He didn't explain what the things were, and she didn't ask. What he pulled from the locked cabinet in the back of his garage on North Elston was not a weapon. It was a small canvas bag that held, among other things, a compact shortwave signal detector, a multi-tool he'd owned for 12 years, a portable battery and charging array, a folded topographic printout of the Cicero Industrial District that he'd downloaded and printed from his phone in the parking lot of Sienna's building, and a pair of thin work gloves. He also changed his flannel shirt for a dark gray thermal layer because the cold was going to worsen after nightfall, and he didn't want to be uncomfortable if they were outside for any length of time. He had owned the signal detector since leaving the military. He told himself it was for professional reasons, checking for RF interference in vehicles with complex electrical systems. That was occasionally true. It was also true that he'd bought it 3 months after leaving because there were periods, particularly in the first 2 years after Rachel died, when the hypervigilance that had kept him alive in bad places didn't understand that the bad places were gone, and having the equipment made the nights quieter. He hadn't needed it for that in a long time. He locked the garage, texted Mrs. Pacheco that he'd likely be late, told her Ava's dinner was in the fridge and just needed the oven at 350 for 20 minutes, and got back in his truck. Sienna was in her personal car, not the company sedan, which she'd correctly identified as a security risk given that its GPS and communication systems ran through Meridian's network. She was driving a dark blue Volvo that she handled with focused competence, which for some reason surprised him slightly and then didn't. They drove in tandem to Cicero without coordination, which wasn't intentional. They'd agreed on the address and left separately, but which worked out fine because Ethan arrived first and had already done a slow pass around the building before she pulled in. The logistics center was a low-slung industrial structure on a dead-end service road that backed up to a freight rail line. 3 loading bays, a glass-fronted office vestibule that was dark, a parking lot with 2 cars in it that shouldn't have been there after business hours, chain-link perimeter, security lights on a timer, no visible cameras on the exterior corners, which was either an oversight or meant the cameras were somewhere less obvious. Ethan pulled onto the service road that ran parallel to the facility and called Sienna's cell. "The 2 cars in the lot," he said when she picked up. "Do they belong here?" A pause. "The building's been dormant for 2 years. They shouldn't. Park on the street, not the lot. Stay in the car until I call you." "What are you—" "Just 2 minutes," he said. He got out and walked the perimeter on foot, staying close to the fence line, not hurrying. The signal detector was in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out and ran it slowly. Old habit, the kind that becomes reflex and stops feeling like a choice. The reading it returned made him stop walking for a moment and look at it. There was a tracking signal broadcasting from the perimeter. Short range, passive. Not a security camera, something smaller. Something you'd attach to a person or an object if you wanted to know when they came and went. He finished the perimeter and called Sienna back. "Do you have anything on you that was given to you in the last 48 hours?" he said. "Anything you didn't buy yourself? Jewelry, a bag, a device?" Silence. "My bracelet," she said slowly. "Graham gave it to me last week. It's an anniversary piece, Sterling Dynamics Centennial. He gave them to the whole executive team." Ethan looked at the signal detector. "Take it off. Don't break it. Don't throw it away. Put it in your glove box and close it. Then get out of the car and come to the east side of the building. There's a gap in the fence near the 3rd utility post." She was quiet for a moment. "It's a tracker," she said. "Yeah." He heard her breathing shift, not panic, just recalibration. The sound of a person adjusting to a new depth of the problem they're already in. "Okay," she said. "Give me a minute." Claire Navarro was already waiting at the east fence gap when Ethan reached it. A woman in her late 50s, shorter than he'd imagined, with silver hair cut short and a wool coat that looked expensive and practical in equal measure. She had a ring of keys in one hand and a hard expression that he read as someone who had decided, probably in the last 24 hours, that they were past the point of pretending this wasn't serious. She looked at him with the frank, assessing gaze of someone who has spent a career evaluating people quickly. "You're the mechanic," she said. "Yeah." "You know what you're doing?" "More or less." She seemed to weigh that. "More or less is going to have to be good enough," she said, and turned toward the fence. The interior of the building was dim and smelled of concrete dust and the particular chemical flatness of a space that hasn't circulated outside air in a long time. Claire moved through it with the confidence of someone who'd been here before, leading them past dormant conveyor infrastructure and shelving systems to a stairwell at the back that went down 1 level to a climate-controlled sublevel where 2 server racks hummed steadily in the dark. She found the light switch. Fluorescence blinked on. Ethan scanned the room. 1 entrance, the stairwell they'd come through. No windows. A secondary door on the far wall, padlocked. Ventilation grates near the ceiling. He noted all of it and said nothing. "The cold storage archive is on the 2nd rack," Claire said. "The data is indexed by fiscal quarter. What we need is the vendor contract records from the last 4 years. That'll be approximately 16 to 20 storage modules." Sienna had already crossed the room and was pulling on a pair of latex gloves from her coat pocket, which told Ethan she'd thought further ahead than this moment. She began pulling storage modules methodically, reading the labels, stacking the ones she needed on a clear section of floor. "How long to copy the relevant files?" Ethan said. 40 minutes, maybe less," Claire said. "I have a drive." He looked at the stairwell, thought about the 2 cars in the parking lot. "Make it 30, he said. Claire connected her drive to the first module without comment. Ethan went to the base of the stairwell and listened. Nothing. He stood there anyway. It was during the listening, that specific quality of silence that he'd spent years learning to read, the way a blind person reads texture, finding the information hidden inside what isn't there, that something came back to him from a place he'd buried carefully and not revisited. Meridian Consolidated Group. The name had been in a different context, a classified operational briefing 7 years ago, during his last active deployment. A joint task force initiative targeting a criminal enterprise that used private security contracts as a money laundering architecture across 3 countries. The organization had operated under different names at different tiers, the kind of structural layering that made it nearly impossible to prosecute because each layer had plausible deniability about the layers above and below it. The task force had gotten close, very close. And then the witnesses had stopped talking, one by one, not through violence, through fear, the kind of fear that doesn't leave marks, just leaves silence. The operation had collapsed. The people at the top had walked. Ethan had come home from that particular mission 9 weeks before Rachel's diagnosis, and everything that came after had consumed the space where that failure might have lived. He hadn't thought about it in years. He was thinking about it now. He came back into the room. Sienna was working through the 3rd module. Claire was watching the progress bar on her drive. "The organization behind this," Ethan said, keeping his voice level. "This isn't just Graham Weston." Both women looked at him. "Weston's a piece of it," he said. "Maybe a significant piece. But the structure you're describing, shell companies, security contract pipelines, the way Meridian was used to get inside your systems, that's not something a board chairman built by himself. That's an architecture. Someone built it specifically to be inserted into companies like yours." Sienna watched him carefully. "You recognize it?" "I've seen something like it before," he said. "A long time ago." She held his gaze. "How long ago?" 7 years. Different names. Same skeleton." He paused. "The operation that identified it failed. The people responsible were never charged." The room was very quiet except for the hum of the server rack and the faint mechanical sound of data transferring from one drive to another. "You were part of that operation," Sienna said. It wasn't a question. "I was." She absorbed that. He watched her do it. The calculation, the shifting of variables, the understanding that the man she'd called because he seemed capable of staying calm in a crisis had a specific and not coincidental reason for knowing exactly what she was dealing with. "And the warning," she said slowly, 4 years ago. The anonymous tip through the compliance line. He didn't answer. "That was you," she said. The silence was its own answer. Sienna set down the module she was holding. She sat down on the edge of an equipment crate and looked at the floor for a moment. When she looked up, her expression was not angry. It was the particular expression of someone who has just understood, fully, the dimensions of a mistake they made years ago and have been living inside ever since without knowing it. "You tried to stop me," she said. "I didn't have documentation, just pattern recognition and the memory of an operation that had already failed once." He paused. "And I wasn't anyone by that point. I was a tow truck driver who used to know things." "You could have—" "What?" His voice wasn't sharp, but it wasn't gentle either. "Called you directly? I didn't know you. I sent what I had through the channel your company provided for exactly that purpose." He held her gaze. "You had audits and a growth target and a board recommendation. I had a hunch and a classified memory I couldn't prove." She looked at him for a long moment. "I ignored it," she said. "Yeah." "Because I wanted the acquisition." "Yeah." She breathed out, long and slow. "I let this happen." "You made a business decision based on incomplete information," he said, "and someone exploited that. Those aren't the same thing. They feel the same." "I know." He met her eyes. "They still aren't." Claire cleared her throat from across the room. 11 minutes, she said quietly, "and I'd like to get out of here before those cars in the parking lot become a problem." Ethan looked at Sienna. She stood up, picked up the module, and went back to work. He returned to the stairwell and listened again. This time, the silence wasn't clean. Somewhere above them, not close, but not far, a door had opened and closed. He came back into the room, crossed to Claire, and said quietly, "How much more?" 7 modules. "Skip the oldest fiscal year, take the last 3 years. Can you extract just those?" She looked at her drive. 30 seconds to reorganize the queue. "Do it!" Sienna had heard him. She was already resorting the stack on the floor without being told, setting aside the oldest modules and keeping the critical ones. I went back to the door, stood to the side of the frame, and listened to the stairwell with the full, disciplined attention of someone who had learned that the information available to your ears in a quiet space is as detailed and readable as anything you can see if you know how to listen. 2 sets of footsteps. 1 floor up, moving slowly. Not searching, not yet, but checking. He came back to the room. 2 minutes, he said. Then we go. Whatever's on the drive at 2 minutes is what we leave with. Sienna looked at him. There's still 2 minutes, he said, and we go out the secondary door. He crossed the room to the padlocked secondary door, assessed the lock for 4 seconds, pulled the multi-tool from his pocket, and got to work. Claire disconnected her drive at 1 minute 47 seconds. The padlock came open at 2 minutes 11. The 3 of them moved through the secondary door into a narrow utility corridor that ran the length of the building's east wall and exited through a fire door that opened onto the service road where Ethan had parked his truck. They walked fast and quietly. When they reached the vehicles, Ethan did a check of Sienna's Volvo, exterior, undercarriage, wheel wells, before he'd let her get in. The bracelet with its tracking device was still in the glove box, still broadcasting quietly to whoever was listening. Leave it there, he said, and drive normally. Direct route home. If anyone is tracking it, they'll see the bracelet going home and they won't know what was on it when it left this building. Sienna looked at him across the roof of her car. And the drive? She said. With Claire, he said. Not you. They'd expect you. Claire, who had been standing by her own car with the drive in her coat pocket, and an expression that suggested she had processed the last 40 minutes and arrived at a place somewhere past fear and into focused determination, gave a single nod. I know where to take it, she said. Sienna held Ethan's gaze. In the dark of the service road, with the freight line behind them and the October cold sharpening the air around them, she looked tired and fully awake at the same time. The specific combination that comes when you've stopped pretending a thing isn't happening and decided to meet it directly. Thank you, she said. Ethan got in his truck. Don't thank me yet, he said through the open window. The hard part of this isn't getting the evidence. It's what happens when Weston figures out you have it. He pulled out of the service road and drove north. Behind him, the 2 sets of headlights in the logistics center parking lot sat dark and still, waiting for a signal from a bracelet that was currently riding in the glove box of a Volvo headed toward Lincoln Park, carrying nothing more dangerous than a woman's carefully maintained silence. For now, that was enough. He got home at 9:47. Mrs. Pacheco had left the porch light on and a note on the kitchen counter that said Ava ate 2 servings and did her homework and went to bed at 8:30. She said to tell you she made the goal at practice. The note was written in the careful, deliberate handwriting of someone who had learned English as a second language and never stopped treating it with respect. Ethan stood at the counter and read it twice, then folded it and put it next to the field trip form in the drawer where he kept things he wasn't ready to throw away. He checked on Ava. She was asleep on her side with one arm hanging off the bed and her mouth slightly open and her soccer cleats sitting in the middle of the floor where they'd been dropped the second she walked through the door, which was where they always ended up, regardless of the number of times he'd suggested the alternative of the shoe rack by the door. He picked them up and set them on the rack in her closet and stood in the doorway for a moment in the dark. She had Rachel's forehead, the particular way her hairline came to a slight point above her left temple. Ethan had noticed it when Ava was 3 days old, and he'd been noticing it ever since, the way you notice something that hurts in a way that doesn't get smaller, just more familiar. He pulled her door mostly closed and went downstairs. He didn't sleep for a long time. He sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the topographic printout he'd made of the Cicero Industrial District, useless now, the job done, and thought through what he knew, which was the habit of someone trained to review an operation before anything had a chance to blur in memory. The 2 cars in the parking lot, the tracking device and the bracelet, the footsteps on the floor above them, moving slowly, checking. Someone had known or suspected that Sienna might go to the archive, which meant either Weston had more reach inside her organization than she understood, or the bracelet tracker had been supplemented by something else, another device, another source. Someone watching her movements at a higher level. The gap between what she knew and what she didn't know was the most dangerous territory in any of this. He'd learned that a long time ago. The things you can see are manageable. The things you can't see are where you get hurt. His phone buzzed at 10 minutes past midnight. Sienna. He picked up. I found something else, she said. No preamble, no apology for the hour. He'd noticed that about her. She didn't waste words on social scaffolding when there was actual information to transmit. He respected it even when it was slightly jarring. What? There's a board meeting scheduled for 5 days from now. Emergency session. Graham called it yesterday morning before business hours, which is unusual. The agenda item listed is leadership continuity planning. A pause. That's the phrase they use in our bylaws for removing a CEO. Ethan sat back in his chair. He's moving faster than you thought. Yes. Her voice was controlled, but just barely. Which means the evidence on Claire's drive needs to reach someone with authority to act on it before that meeting. Once the board votes, even if the vote is later overturned, the interim control of the company passes to a committee that Graham chairs. He'd have access to everything, every record, every system, every person. Including the archive. Including whatever's left in it that we didn't take tonight. She paused again. Ethan, the attorney I trust. Claire. She's good. She knows corporate law. But this has crossed into territory that requires federal jurisdiction. We need someone inside a federal structure who can receive the evidence formally, open an investigation, and do it without tipping Weston's network before it's sealed. What about going directly to the FBI? I've thought about that. The problem is Meridian's network spent 4 years embedding inside our company, which means they know our communication channels, our security vendors, possibly our legal contacts. If I walk into a federal building and file a complaint through the standard intake process, it goes through a system. And if that system has been compromised anywhere along the routing, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Ethan understood the geometry of the problem. You can't use a compromised channel to report a compromise. The message eats itself. I know someone, he said. Silence. From before, he added, your Navy days. Adjacent to that, he thought of a face he hadn't seen in 4 years, a voice he hadn't heard in longer. Her name is Renata Voss. She was DOJ when I knew her, Department of Justice, Financial Crimes Division. She moved to a federal task force on corporate fraud about 3 years ago. She's out of the Chicago field office. He paused. I don't know if she'll take my call. We didn't end on bad terms, but we didn't end particularly well either. What does that mean? It means she told me I was throwing my career away, and I told her some things I probably should have phrased differently. He stared at the water glass. But she's clean. If there's anyone in the federal structure in this city who hasn't been touched by what you're describing, it's Renata. Can you call her tonight? I'll call her in the morning, early. He paused. Get some sleep, Sienna. A short, humorless sound. Sure. I mean it. You can't think straight on no sleep, and tomorrow is going to require straight thinking. A longer pause this time. Are you always this practical? When it matters, he said. She said goodnight and hung up. He sat for another few minutes, then went to bed, and was asleep within 4 minutes because that was another thing the military had given him that he'd kept without trying. The ability to sleep when sleep was available, regardless of circumstances, because you learned fast that the body is not optional and rest is not a reward, it is maintenance. He called Renata Voss at 6:15 the next morning from his truck, parked outside the garage before Ava was awake. She picked up on the third ring, which told him she was already working. Calloway. Her voice was exactly as he remembered it, dry, precise, not unkind, but not warm either. The voice of someone who processed everything through a filter of evidence and relevance. It's been a while. Yeah, I know. You still in Chicago? Still here. He paused. You? Same field office, different desk. A brief pause on her end. This isn't a social call. No. All right. He heard her close a door. Go. He gave her the outline in 10 minutes. Sienna, Sterling Dynamics, Meridian, the shell companies, Graham Weston, the 640 million, the archive, the evidence on Claire's drive. He did not editorialize. He presented it the way he'd been trained to present operational intelligence, sequentially, factually, with clear identification of what was confirmed versus inferred. When he finished, Renata was quiet for a moment. The anonymous compliance tip 4 years ago, she said. That was you. Yeah. I wondered. Another pause. There was a case file opened around that time, an inquiry into Meridian Consolidated's acquisition history. It was closed 8 months later for insufficient evidence. Her voice carried the flat neutrality of someone describing a frustration they've made peace with. The file examiner was transferred to another division 6 weeks after closing it. Transferred or pushed? Unknown. She paused. Possibly both. Ethan looked at the garage door. So there's a file. There was a file. Whether it can be reopened and what shape it's in, that's a different conversation. He heard her moving, the sound of a chair, papers. The woman you're working with, Sterling, you trust her. I trust what I've seen, he said, which is about 48 hours of a person under pressure making mostly good decisions and being honest about the bad ones. That's a pretty qualified trust. It's the kind I have. Renata made a sound that was almost a laugh. All right, tell her attorney to secure that drive in a personally controlled location, not a law firm server, not cloud storage, a physical drive in a personally controlled location. I'll need to receive it through a specific channel to maintain chain of custody. I'll send you an address. Another pause. And Callaway. This has to be airtight before I can move. If Weston's network has reach into federal structures, and from what you're describing, that's possible, one premature move and the evidence gets buried and everyone involved gets discredited. I know, including you. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. Why are you doing this? He thought about how to answer that. The operation 7 years ago, he said finally. The one that failed. The witnesses that went quiet. He paused. The people who were supposed to go to prison didn't. The people who testified anyway lost things. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel. I walked away from it because I had to, but I didn't stop thinking about it. Renata didn't say anything for a few seconds. I'll send you the address, she said. Don't call me on this line again. I'll send you a secondary number with the address. A pause, and then quieter. It's good to hear your voice, Ethan, even under these circumstances. Yeah, he said. You too. He ended the call and sat in the truck for a minute in the cold morning, watching the street wake up around him. A man walking a dog. A city bus going past. The lights coming on in the dry cleaner across the street. The ordinary machine of a Tuesday morning in Chicago, indifferent to what was moving underneath it. Then he went inside and made Ava's breakfast. The next 4 days were a different kind of work than anything Ethan had done in years. It wasn't physical, or not primarily. It was the sustained, grinding cognitive labor of managing multiple moving parts across multiple people, while none of those people could communicate openly, and all of them were operating with incomplete information. It was in the specific and unglamorous way that actual operations differ from the way people imagine them, mostly waiting and planning and making small decisions that felt inconsequential and weren't. Renata's secondary contact number arrived in a text from an unregistered device. She and Claire established a formal evidentiary handoff protocol that Claire executed with the careful precision of someone who had spent 3 decades making sure documents were unimpeachable. The drive passed from Claire's personal possession to Renata's through a chain of custody that was documented at every step. Sienna stayed in the building. She went to meetings. She signed documents. She sat across the boardroom table from Graham Weston twice during those 4 days and looked at him with the controlled professional expression of someone who had nothing on her mind except quarterly projections and infrastructure contract renewals. And afterward, she told Ethan that both times she'd felt physically ill in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the specific revulsion of being very close to someone who has been lying to your face for years. Did he seem suspicious? Ethan asked. They were on the phone, always the phone, never in person in the building, at Ethan's insistence. He seemed fine, she said. That's the thing that's hard to get past. He's been doing this for so long that it doesn't show on him anymore. A pause. He asked me today if I was feeling all right, said I seemed distracted. What did you say? I told him I was tired, that the board meeting prep was keeping me up. She paused. He put his hand on my shoulder and said not to worry, that he'd been handling board dynamics for 22 years and I could always count on him. Her voice was steady, but only barely. He is extremely good at this. That's how these people operate, Ethan said. The ones who last long enough to move $600 million don't look like what they are. They look like the most trustworthy person in the room. How do you deal with that? Knowing that someone can be that completely different from what they present? He thought about it. You stop expecting people's outsides to match their insides, he said, and you start watching what they do instead of what they say, over time. He paused. It's a useful skill. It's also a hard way to go through life. She didn't say anything to that for a moment. Is that why you left? She said. The military. Was it just Ava, or was it also that? He hadn't expected the question, which didn't mean it was the wrong one. He sat with it. It was mostly Ava, he said. But you're not entirely wrong. Well, on the morning of the fourth day, Renata called the secondary number. We have a problem, she said. Ethan was in the garage, halfway through an oil change on a Honda Accord belonging to a woman who drove it to the community college where she taught remedial English 3 days a week. He pulled himself out from under it and stood up. What kind? Someone accessed the old Meridian case file. Her voice was careful in the way voices get when the information is bad enough that you choose each word individually. The file I told you about, the one that was opened and closed 4 years ago. Someone pulled it from federal records 2 days ago. Who? That's the problem. The access credentials used belong to an active duty federal employee, but the employee in question filed for medical leave 6 weeks ago and hasn't been in the building. A pause. Someone used her credentials while she was out, and the only reason to pull that file right now, after 4 years of it sitting dormant, is if someone knew we were looking at it. Ethan was very still. They know, he said. Someone knows something, Renata said, whether they know the full scope or they're just covering tracks. I can't tell yet, but it means our timeline just got compressed. She paused. The board meeting is tomorrow. He thought fast. The evidence on Claire's drive, is it sufficient to support a federal hold on the board vote? It's sufficient to support an emergency filing for a judicial injunction to delay the vote pending investigation. Whether a judge signs off on that injunction in the next... He heard her checking something. 18 hours is a different question. What do you need from us? I need one more piece, she said. Everything on the drive is financial documentation. It's damning, but it's paper. What I need is something that establishes Weston's direct operational awareness. A communication, email, recorded conversation, anything, showing he knew the shell companies were fraudulent. Right now, everything is technically attributable to Meridian's management structure, and Weston's attorneys will argue he was deceived along with everyone else. Ethan thought about that. There's a distribution center, he said, the one Meridian uses for its active security operations, not the archive in Cicero, the main facility. He paused, remembering the outline Sienna had described in the conference room. Meridian's operational communications run through servers in that facility, internal messaging, contract authorizations, personnel directives. If there are communications between Weston and Meridian's management that are stored on those servers, they'd be what you need, Ethan said. Getting to them legally would take a warrant. A warrant requires a judge requires time we don't have. Renata's voice was measured. I'm not telling you to do anything illegal, Calloway. I know, he said. I'm also not in a position to know what a private individual might choose to do on their own time. I understand. A pause. Be careful, she said, and hung up. He stood in the garage for a moment. Then he called Sienna. The Meridian Distribution Center was in the Pilsen neighborhood, a converted industrial building that Meridian had taken on a long-term commercial lease 4 years ago. The same year the acquisition closed, which was the kind of coincidence that stopped being a coincidence the moment you understood what the building was actually for. It was 3 stories, solid brick, the kind of construction that dated from the early 20th century and had outlasted everything built around it. The ground floor was a legitimate operational hub, vehicle staging, equipment storage, security personnel rotation. The upper 2 floors were administrative, and it was on the 3rd floor that the communications infrastructure lived. Ethan, Sienna, and Claire had spent 90 minutes on the phone the previous night working through what they had. Claire had provided the building's lease documentation. She'd handled the original filing, along with a floor plan that was 4 years old and therefore probably partially inaccurate. Sienna had access to Meridian's public-facing operational calendar through a Sterling Dynamics shared scheduling system. She'd identified a window, 6 in the morning, when the overnight security rotation changed and the administrative floors were unmanned for a brief period during the shift handoff. It was not a good plan. Ethan had said so explicitly. What would make it a good plan? Sienna had asked. More time. More people. Better floor plans. He'd paused. A warrant. We don't have those things. No, he said. We don't. Claire had been quiet for a moment on the call. Then she'd said, I've spent 30 years keeping people out of legal trouble. I'm aware of what we're discussing. Another pause. I'm also aware that the legal system that's supposed to protect people from exactly this kind of theft is going to need someone to do something uncomfortable before it can do its job. She'd sounded like she was talking herself into something, which meant she was also talking herself through something. I'll handle the entry documentation, which was how the three of them found themselves standing outside the Meridian Distribution Center in Pilsen at 5:47 in the morning, in the dark, in the cold, dressed as industrial safety inspectors. The disguise had been Sienna's idea. Sterling Dynamics contracted safety inspections for its facilities through a third-party firm that used a standardized uniform, dark navy coveralls with a reflective stripe and a company logo. Sienna had 2 sets in her building's facilities management closet, used for actual inspections. Claire had found a third by calling the inspection firm's after-hours contact and explaining that they had an emergency compliance review at a client facility and needed a set overnighted. The inspection firm had complied because Sterling Dynamics was their largest contract client. The coveralls were slightly too large on Sienna and significantly too large on Claire. Ethan's fit reasonably. He carried a clipboard with actual inspection forms that Claire had pulled from Sterling's internal compliance database, and a hard case that contained, among other things, the signal detector, the multi-tool, and a small secondary drive that Renata had sent via the secondary channel text, with a brief instruction set about which file directories to target and how to copy them without leaving system-level traces. He'd read the instruction set twice and memorized it. The shift change starts at 6, Ethan said. We have about 12 minutes of movement during the handoff. That's when the administrative floor cameras go to a reduced recording mode because the motion detection system is calibrated for the security rotation, not an inspection team. How do you know the camera calibration? Sienna said. I don't, for certain, he said. But Meridian uses a specific motion detection software that I've seen before, and the default calibration for facilities this size has a known gap during shift change periods. If they haven't customized it, and if they have, then we're visible from the moment we step inside and we need a different reason to be there. He looked at the clipboard, which is why we're safety inspectors. Claire made a sound that was not quite a laugh. I haven't done anything this inadvisable since law school, she said. What did you do in law school? Sienna asked. You don't need to know that, Claire said. They went in through the ground floor entrance at 6:01, when a tired-looking security guard in a Meridian uniform was in the process of signing out, and a fresher-looking one was in the process of signing in, and neither of them was paying a great deal of attention to anything that wasn't the handoff clipboard. Ethan held the inspection forms at a slight angle that made them visible without being readable, and said, to no one in particular, Compliance walkthrough, 3rd floor. We'll be out of your hair in 20 minutes. The outgoing guard barely looked up. The incoming guard nodded. They took the stairs. The 2nd floor was empty. The 3rd floor was dark except for the ambient glow of server indicator lights and the thin gray early light coming through 2 high-set windows on the north wall. The room was organized differently than the cold storage archive in Cicero. This was active infrastructure, rack upon rack of servers with cable management in various states of tidiness. The specific organized chaos of a system that had been built in pieces over time and never quite rationalized into a whole. Ethan found the communications server cluster in 4 minutes. He knew what he was looking for. The instruction set Renata had sent described the directory architecture for this specific software configuration with the kind of precision that told him she'd done her homework, which meant she'd been moving on this faster than she'd let on. He connected the drive. Sienna positioned herself at the top of the stairwell, listening, in the same way he'd stood at the base of the stairwell in Cicero 4 days ago. She'd asked no instruction. She'd simply done it, which told him something about how she processed situations when the scaffolding of boardrooms and corporate protocol was stripped away. Claire stood near the window and watched the street below. The extraction process took 11 minutes. The cursor moved through directories, internal messaging archives, contract authorization logs, personnel communication chains. The instruction set was precise and the drive was fast. At minute 9, Sienna said quietly from the stairwell, "Someone's coming up." Ethan didn't stop the extraction. "One or more?" "One. Moving slow." "Maintenance or security?" "Can't tell." He looked at the progress bar. 83%. "If they get to the top of the stairs before it finishes," he said, "we're inspectors. We're confused about which floor has the HVAC access panel. Act like you belong here." "I do belong here," Sienna said, with a slight edge that was not fear but something adjacent to offense. "This is technically my company's leased facility." "Then you're even more convincing," he said. 91%. The footsteps reached the second floor landing. 96%. They slowed on the second floor. The sound of a door. The second floor bathroom, Ethan guessed, or a utility room. 99%. The drive completed. He disconnected it, pocketed it, and had the clipboard back in his hands by the time the footsteps resumed on the stairwell. A maintenance worker emerged at the top of the stairs and stopped when he saw them. Surprised, not suspicious. He was about 50, heavy-set, with a utility belt and a thermos. Ethan looked at the clipboard. "HVAC compliance check. You know which floor has the main access panel for the east ventilation system?" The man pointed down. "Second floor. There's a door behind the copy room. Easy to miss." "That's what I figured," Ethan said. "Appreciate it." They went down the stairs. On the street, in the early morning, with the drive in his pocket and the sky turning a flat, cold gray above the Pilsen rooftops, Ethan breathed out slowly and looked at his watch. 6:22. They'd been inside 31 minutes. Sienna stood beside him. Her jaw was tight, and her hands were in her pockets, and she was working hard to look like someone who hadn't just spent the last 30 minutes doing something that made her professional life look tranquil by comparison. "Good?" she said. "Good," he said. Claire appeared at his other side. "I need a very strong coffee and approximately one conversation that does not involve criminal exposure," she said. "After," Ethan said. His phone buzzed. "Renata's secondary number." He answered. "Did you get it?" she said. "Just came out." "Get the drive to the same drop point as before, today, before noon." A pause, and he heard something in her voice that he hadn't heard in the previous calls, the particular register of someone who has found something. "I've been in the case file, Calloway, the one that was accessed. Before they pulled it, someone added something to it." He heard papers. "A financial record. A transfer of $2 million to an account registered to a private individual." A pause. "The account holder's name is Ethan M. Calloway." He stopped walking. The street went quiet around him in a way that had nothing to do with actual noise. "That's fabricated," he said. "I know that," Renata said, "but it's in the file, officially documented, which means the moment this case becomes public, that record becomes part of the discoverable record." Her voice was careful and steady. "Someone is trying to discredit you before you can be a witness, or they're trying to create leverage, or both." Sienna had noticed he'd stopped. She was watching him. "It uses details from my service record," Ethan said slowly. "My middle initial. My account structure." "Yes," Renata said. "Whoever built it had access to your sealed military records." Ethan looked at the drive in his hand. Sealed military records. Which meant someone, somewhere in the chain between his service and now, had pulled information that should not have been accessible. Which meant the network Weston had built, or was part of, had reaches into federal personnel systems that went well beyond a corporate acquisition. "Does the evidence on this drive address it?" he said. "Potentially. The internal communications may show when the fabrication was created and who authorized it. If we can establish that the financial record was planted after the investigation opened." She paused. "It helps you. But Ethan, right now, officially, that record exists." He was quiet for a moment. "I understand," he said. "Get me the drive," she said, and hung up. He stood on the sidewalk in Pilsen in the cold morning. Around him, the neighborhood was waking up. A corner store pulling up its security gate, a woman in scrubs walking fast toward a bus stop, the distant sound of a train on the elevated line 3 blocks east. Sienna was beside him. She'd heard enough. What was that? She said. He told her. Flat, factual, the same way he told her everything. When he finished, she was quiet. He watched her face go through something. A sequence of reactions she mostly managed to contain, but not entirely. At the edge of it was the look of a woman who has just been handed information that would be very convenient to believe if she needed to believe it. She looked at him. You need to say it, he said. I'm not going to... You need to say it, he repeated, because if you don't say it now, it sits between us and it gets worse. She held his gaze, held it for a long moment. For 1 second, she said, about 1 second, I thought, I know. And then I didn't. I don't. She breathed out. I don't believe it. Okay. But I need you to understand that they put it there specifically so that I would, she said. So that even the people who know you would have that 1 second. Yeah, he said. That's the point. She looked at the drive in his hand, and that's what's on there? The proof that it's fabricated? If we're lucky, he said. And the proof of everything else. He put the drive in his pocket. They started walking toward the car. His hands were steady. His jaw was tight in a way he didn't try to relax. He was angry, not the hot, reactive anger of the moment, but the cold, compressed kind that he'd learned to carry in difficult places. The kind that doesn't spend itself until there's somewhere useful for it to go. Someone had gone into his sealed military record. They had taken the facts of his life, his name, his service, his financial history, and built a lie around them. Not because they needed the money or the leverage, because they needed, in the specific and calculated way that these people operated, to make him disappear before he could make them visible. He'd seen it before. 7 years ago. The witnesses who went quiet. The case file that closed. Not this time. Claire fell into step beside him. She didn't say anything for half a block. Then she said quietly, For what it's worth, I've been a lawyer for 30 years, and I've learned one reliable way to tell if someone is actually guilty of something. What's that? He said. Guilty people don't keep protecting the person they supposedly betrayed, she said. They save themselves. He didn't respond to that, but he felt it land. They reached the car, and the drive was in his pocket, and the board meeting was 22 hours away, and the cold morning was getting lighter by degrees in the way that Chicago mornings do in October, so slowly, reluctantly, as if the dark doesn't want to let go. Renata called at 2 in the afternoon. Ethan was under a truck, a different truck, a customer's F-250, with a fuel line issue that he'd been ignoring for an hour while thinking about everything except fuel lines, when his phone buzzed on the concrete beside him. He pulled himself out and answered it with grease on his forearm and the cold garage floor still in his bones. The communications from the Pilsen facility, Renata said, without introduction. We've been through the first pass. There are 47 internal messages between Weston and Meridian's operational director across an 18-month period. Explicit references to the shell company structure. Explicit references to the routing system used to move funds. And a pause that had weight in it. 3 messages in which Weston specifically directs the operational director to accelerate the extraction timeline before the fiscal year audit window. Ethan leaned against the truck and looked at the garage ceiling. That's what you needed, he said. That's exactly what I needed, Renata said. Combined with the financial documentation from Claire's drive, we have a case that a federal prosecutor can take to a grand jury. Another pause. I have a judge. Emergency injunction to delay the board vote. She's reviewing it right now. I expect a ruling within 4 hours. And the fabricated record. The $2 million in my name. Also in the communications, Renata said. There's a message, 7 days ago, from Weston to the operational director that reads, and I'm quoting directly here, use the Callaway file, standard discrediting protocol. The military record access was authorized through a compromised DoD contractor account that Meridian had been maintaining for 2 years. A pause. So yes, we can prove it was fabricated. We can prove who ordered it and when. He breathed out. There's one more thing, Renata said, and her voice changed register slightly, moving from the precise delivery of evidentiary findings to something more careful. Weston has a lawyer, a good one, and that lawyer is going to argue when this goes public that Sterling herself was complicit, that the CEO of the company cannot have been unaware of $600 million moving through her vendor system over 4 years. She wasn't aware, Ethan said. I believe that. You believe that. Her attorney believes that. But belief and legal standing are different things, and the first 48 hours of this going public are going to be the most damaging, regardless of what the eventual outcome is. A pause. She needs to get ahead of it. Whatever she decides to say, she needs to say it first, before Weston's people control the narrative. Ethan thought about Sienna at the window of the conference room on the 38th floor. The way she'd said, "I let this happen," not performing regret, not positioning herself, just stating a fact that cost her something to say out loud. "She knows," he said. "Make sure," Renata said. "Because people know things right up until the moment that knowing them becomes expensive, and then sometimes they know them differently." "She's not that kind of person." Renata was quiet for a moment. "You've known her for 5 days." "Yeah," he said. "I know." He ended the call and stood in the garage for a moment. The F-250 waited behind him with its fuel line issue, indifferent to everything else. He looked at it, then looked at his phone, then called Sienna. She picked up immediately, which told him she'd been waiting. "Renata has what she needs," he said. "Injunctions being reviewed. You'll know within 4 hours whether the board meeting is delayed." Silence for a moment. "And if the injunction is denied," she said, "then the meeting happens tomorrow morning and you walk in there with what you know and you say it out loud in front of everyone." He paused. But Renata said something else, about getting ahead of the story. He heard Sienna breathe. "She's right," Sienna said. "I know she is. I wanted to hear you say it." A pause. "You wanted to make sure I actually meant it, or if I was just saying what sounded right?" "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had the quality of someone who has decided something and is now simply describing the decision rather than still making it. "When this comes out, and it's going to come out, tomorrow or the day after, the story is going to be that I ran a company that stole from hundreds of people, and I either knew or I should have known, and Weston's lawyers are going to push every day to make that story stick." A pause. "The only thing I can do about that is make sure the true version is said out loud by me, in my own words, before anyone else gets to frame it." Another pause. "Which means standing up in a boardroom, or wherever this ends, and saying that I made decisions that let this happen and that I'm accountable for them regardless of what the investigation ultimately finds." "That's going to cost you," Ethan said. "I know. People are going to use it against you even if you're legally cleared." "I know that too." Her voice was flat, not hard. The flatness of someone who has done the math and accepted the answer. "But the alternative is to spend the next several years in a defensive crouch, blaming Weston for everything and positioning myself as a victim. And She stopped, restarted. "I'm not willing to do that, even if it's technically accurate, even if it would probably work." A pause. "My grandfather built that company. My father built it into something real. The people who work there, most of them had nothing to do with any of this. They deserve someone at the top who actually means it when she says she takes responsibility." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. "Now what?" "Now we wait on the judge," he said. "And you should probably figure out what you're going to say tomorrow, because whether the meeting is delayed or not, at some point in the next 24 hours, you're going to have to say it." "I know what I'm going to say," she said. He believed her. The injunction was granted at 6:17 that evening. Renata texted the secondary number, one line, "Judge signed. Board meeting delayed 72 hours. Federal hold in effect." Ethan read it standing in the kitchen while Ava ate dinner across the table and described, in considerable and forensic detail, the social dynamics of her 6th-grade lunch table, which had undergone significant reorganization due to an incident involving a stolen water bottle and a disputed seating arrangement that had apparently rocked the foundations of the established order. He listened to all of it. He asked 2 follow-up questions. He refilled her water glass. After dinner, Ava did homework at the table while he cleaned up. And when she went to bed, he sat in the kitchen again with the same glass of water and thought about the next 72 hours. The injunction bought time, but it also announced that something was happening. Weston would know by morning, if he didn't know already. And men who had spent 22 years building the infrastructure to protect themselves from exactly this kind of exposure did not sit still when the exposure began. His phone buzzed at 9:30. Unknown number. Not Renata's secondary, not Sienna, not Claire. A Chicago area code he didn't recognize. He let it ring. It rang again 30 seconds later. Same number. He answered. The voice on the other end was male, older, with the particular even-measured quality of someone who has spent a career choosing words carefully in high-stakes conversations. Mr. Calloway, my name is Daniel Reyes. I'm the operational director for Meridian Consolidated Group. Ethan said nothing. I believe you know who I am, Reyes said. I know who you are, Ethan said. A pause. I'd like to meet with you. Tonight, if possible. I have information that I think is relevant to the situation developing around Sterling Dynamics, and I believe it's in both our interests to have a conversation before tomorrow. Ethan looked at the kitchen wall. Why me? He said. If you have information, there are federal investigators who are already positioned to receive it. Because the federal investigators don't know everything yet, Reyes said, and there are things I can tell you that I can't tell them. Not yet. Not without certain protections being in place first. A pause. I'm not the enemy you think I am, Mr. Calloway. What do I think you are? I think you believe I'm part of what Graham Weston built, and I am, in the sense that I ran its operations for 4 years. His voice shifted very slightly. What I am not is someone who is willing to go to prison for a man who, 3 days ago, authorized a protocol specifically designed to destroy my family's financial history, along with yours, if this investigation got too close. A pause. He burned me, Mr. Calloway. Before you could. Ethan absorbed that. He thought about the fabricated financial record in the federal case file. Standard discrediting protocol. If Weston had deployed it against Ethan, a man who was technically a civilian witness with no official standing, then when the walls closed in completely, he'd use it against everyone, including the people inside his own operation. Where? Ethan said. Reyes gave him an address. A coffee shop in Wicker Park. Public, well-lit, the kind of place that would have people in it at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night. Not a trap. Or not a stupid one. Come alone, Reyes said. I'll decide that, Ethan said, and hung up. He sat for a moment. Then he called Sienna and told her what had happened. Don't go, she said immediately. He's turning, Ethan said. If he has recorded communications, anything Weston said directly to him, anything that establishes Weston's personal direction of the operation, that's the last piece of the case. Or it's Weston sending someone to find out how much you know. It could be, he said. But the detail about burning him first, that tracks. If Weston deployed the discrediting protocol against me, Reyes would know. It's his system. He paused. Someone who's still loyal doesn't call the witness. They just wait. Silence on the line. I'm coming with you, she said. No. Ethan, if he sees you, he closes up. You're the CEO he's been stealing from for 4 years. Whatever he's willing to say to me, he won't say in front of you. He paused. And if I'm wrong about him, I need you somewhere safe with Claire and Renata's number on speed dial. She was quiet. I'll call you the second I'm out, he said. The coffee shop in Wicker Park was called Blue Thread, and it had exposed brick walls and a playlist that was trying slightly too hard. It was about a third full shape. Couples, people on laptops, a table of 4 women in their 60s who were talking with the concentrated energy of a book club that had stopped discussing the book. Ethan got there 10 minutes early and took a seat with his back to the wall and a line of sight to both the front door and the side exit. Daniel Reyes walked in at exactly 10 o'clock. He was 61 or 62, with the build of someone who had been fit 30 years ago and was still mostly carrying it. Silver hair, dark eyes, the kind of face that had probably inspired confidence in a professional setting because it was the face of someone who looked like they knew what they were doing. He looked tired in the deep way. Not sleepy, but the specific exhaustion of someone who has been running hard for a long time and has recently admitted to themselves that they need to stop. He sat down across from Ethan without offering his hand. Ethan didn't offer his either. Reyes looked at him for a moment. You're younger than I expected, he said. You're older than the file photo, Ethan said. That landed with a slight wince. Reyes looked at the table. You've been thorough. I had help. Reyes folded his hands. He had the slightly formal body language of someone who has rehearsed what they're going to say and is now trying to decide whether to deliver it as rehearsed or to scrap the script and just talk. After a moment, he scrapped the script. "I built Meridian 15 years ago," he said. "Started it as a legitimate operation, personnel vetting, executive protection, facility security, mid-sized corporate clients. We were good at it." He paused. 8 years ago, Weston approached me through an intermediary. He had a proposition. He said he had access to the corporate infrastructure of several large-scale companies, vendor systems, contract approval chains, audit protocols, and he wanted a security operation that could serve as the operational layer for a financial diversion network. He said it flatly, without effect, the way a person describes something they've been carrying for a long time and have given up trying to soften. He was very clear about what it was. I was very clear about what I said yes to. "Why did you?" Ethan said. A pause. "Because Meridian was going under. We'd lost 3 major contracts in 1 year, I had 32 employees, and I had convinced myself that I was going to fix it from the inside, take Weston's money, stabilize the company, and then find a way out." He looked at his hands. "That's the story I told myself. The actual truth is that I needed the money, and I told myself a story that let me take it." Ethan said nothing. "The Sterling Dynamics acquisition was Weston's idea," Reyes said. "He'd been positioning it for 2 years before he pitched it to the board. Sterling was the largest single infrastructure platform he'd identified, and once Meridian was folded in, the access to the vendor systems and the contract approval architecture was—" He stopped. "It was extraordinary, more than he'd projected." A pause. "Over 4 years, the total diversion was $642 million. Not all of it went to Weston. There are other parties. 2 of them are outside the country. Weston is the domestic face, but he's not the top of the structure." Ethan went very still. "Who's above him?" he said. Reyes looked at him. "That's the part I need protections for. You need to tell a federal investigator, not me." "I know that," Reyes said. "I'm telling you because you're the one who has the investigator's trust right now, and I need someone to walk me through that door in a way that doesn't end with me in a holding cell before I've said what I know." He paused. "I have recordings. Audio recordings of 12 conversations between myself and Weston across an 18-month period. I have documentation of 3 wire transfers, above Weston's level, into accounts I can identify. And I have a name." He held Ethan's gaze. "One name, at the top of the domestic structure, that will change the scope of this investigation significantly." Ethan looked at him. He was reading the room the way he always read rooms. Not just what was being said, but the body underneath the words, the hands, the eyes, the breathing pattern, the particular quality of the pauses. Reyes was scared. Not in the performative way of someone running a play. In the genuine way of a man who has realized, probably recently and with full clarity, that the organization he'd been part of for 8 years would eliminate him as efficiently as it had tried to eliminate Ethan's credibility, and that the only direction with any survivable outcome was forward. "I can make a call," Ethan said. "Tonight. There's a federal investigator, DOJ, Financial Crimes, who is already inside this case. If she agrees to a protected interview, you talk to her. Not through intermediaries, not through lawyers first. You. Tonight or early tomorrow." He paused. "But I need the recordings on the table. Not as a condition, as proof that you're serious. Because if you're wasting my time, I walk, and whatever protections you are hoping for go with me." Reyes reached into his coat and placed a small digital recorder on the table between them. Ethan looked at it. "It's a copy," Reyes said. "The originals are secured. I'm not completely inexperienced." Ethan picked it up. He didn't play it in the coffee shop. He put it in his pocket. "I'll make the call," he said. "Don't go home tonight. Go somewhere that isn't your apartment or any address connected to Meridian." Reyes nodded. He looked for a moment like what he actually was. A man in his 60s who had made choices he couldn't undo and was trying to do the one useful thing still available to him. It didn't make him sympathetic, exactly, but it made him human, and Ethan had learned a long time ago that human and sympathetic were different categories. He stepped out of the coffee shop into the cold Wicker Park night and called Renata Tsum. What followed was not a movie. It was paperwork and phone calls and a 2-hour protected interview at a DOJ field office that Ethan drove Reyes to at midnight and waited outside while Renata's team ran the recordings through authentication, and Reyes gave a formal statement that took most of the night to complete. Ethan sat in the hallway on a plastic chair and drank bad coffee from a vending machine and called Sienna at 12:30 to tell her what was happening. "He's talking," she said. "He's talking." "The recordings are real?" Renata's team is verifying, but Reyes knew things he couldn't have known from a constructed narrative, operational details, specific dates, account structures. It's real. A long pause. "Ethan, who's above Weston?" "Renata will tell you what she can when she can tell it. It's not my information to give." She absorbed that. "Okay. How are you doing?" he said. A pause. "I keep thinking about the people in the company, the people who had nothing to do with this. An account manager I have who's been with us for 18 years. My head of communications, who has 2 kids. What this is going to do to them. Even if the company survives this, the reputational damage in the next few weeks is going to be..." "That's not a small thing," he said. "No." Her voice was tired. Not defeated, just the honest tiredness of someone who has been carrying something heavy and hasn't set it down yet. "I keep coming back to the warning, 4 years ago." She paused. "If I had listened..." "You can do that math for the rest of your life," he said. "It won't change the number." "I know. What you can change is what you do starting tomorrow." She was quiet for a moment. "You're very good at saying things that are both true and unhelpful." He laughed, a short, real one. "Yeah, I've been told." "Does it ever get easier?" she said. "Living with the thing you got wrong?" He thought about Rachel, about the deployment he was on when she got the diagnosis, about the 10 days between the call and when he got home, about what those 10 days meant in terms of what she'd gone through without him, about whether staying would have changed anything, and the honest answer being that it would have changed nothing medically and everything else. "No," he said, "it doesn't get easier. You just get better at carrying it." He paused, which sounds like the same thing, but isn't. She said goodnight quietly, and he sat in the hallway until 3 in the morning when Renata came out and told him that Reyes's statement was solid, the recordings were authenticated, and that she was filing for an emergency expansion of the case scope first thing in the morning. "Go home, Calloway," she said. She looked tired too, the productive tired of someone who has worked hard enough to move something heavy. "You've done what you can do here." "The board meeting," he said. "Even with the injunction delayed, at some point Sienna has to walk into that room." "Tomorrow afternoon," Renata said. "We'll have enough on the record by then to move on Weston simultaneously. We coordinate the timing. She walks into the room while our team moves on his location. He won't have time to deploy anything." She paused. "She needs to know the timing, and she needs to be in that boardroom at 2 o'clock exactly." "She'll be there," Ethan said. He drove home through the empty streets of Chicago at 3:15 in the morning. The city at that hour had a different quality than the city at any other time, stripped down to its actual structure, the bones of it visible without the flesh of daytime traffic and noise, just the light patterns and the lake wind and the occasional truck moving through intersections that didn't need to be navigated because nothing else was competing for them. He got home, checked on Ava, still sideways across the bed, arm hanging off the edge, and went to his own room and lay down without changing his clothes and stared at the ceiling. He thought about Reyes sitting in a government interview room in the middle of the night, talking his way toward whatever the rest of his life was going to look like. He thought about Claire, who had been sending him terse, competent updates all evening from her home office, and who had, at some point around 11, sent one that just said, "In 30 years of practice, I have never worn coveralls. I am choosing to view this as personal growth." He had almost laughed out loud at that one. He thought about Sienna in her apartment on the north side, probably awake, probably with a legal pad covered in notes, probably going through what she was going to say tomorrow. The way he imagined she went through every difficult thing, methodically, repeatedly, from every angle, until the words were solid enough to stand on. He thought about what Renata had said. People know things right up until the moment that knowing them becomes expensive. He thought about tomorrow. 2 o'clock. The boardroom on the 44th floor. He didn't sleep for long, but he slept. Sienna called him at 7 the next morning. "I've been writing," she said. "What you're going to say?" "Yes. And I keep making it. I keep making it too careful, too structured, too much like a press release and not enough like the truth." A pause. "Every time I try to write the part about the acquisition, I write around it instead of through it. I say things like, Decisions were made in a challenging environment instead of, I chose the deal over the warning. Then say the second one, he said. It's harder. Yeah, he said. That's usually the tell. She was quiet. Will you be there? At 2 o'clock. He hadn't planned to be. His role in this, the part that had a name and a function, was over. Renata's team had what they needed. Claire would be at the building. Whatever happened in that boardroom was Sienna's to navigate, and the presence of a tow truck mechanic from North Elston in a meeting of corporate board members and federal investigators was not going to add anything legible to the situation. He knew all of that. Yeah, he said. I'll be there. He heard her breathe out, just once, quick, controlled. Thank you, she said. He drove to this garage. He told the Honda Accord's owner that her car was ready. He wrote up the invoice and kept the labor rate where it always was for the community college teacher, which was not where it would have been for someone else. He worked until noon. At 12:30, he went home, showered, put on the one collared shirt he owned that wasn't flannel, and drove to South Wacker Drive. The building's lobby was different than it had been 6 days ago. There were two men in dark suits near the security desk who had the look of federal law enforcement even in civilian clothes, the particular flatness of attention that people in that profession develop. Renata had coordinated the timing precisely. As Sienna walked into the boardroom, search warrants were being executed at Graham Weston's home office in Lake Forest and at 3 Meridian facilities simultaneously. Ethan went to the 38th floor. Not the 44th, where the boardroom was. He stood by the window at the end of the corridor and looked at the river, the same view Sienna had been looking at when he'd first come to this building, and waited. At 1:53, his phone buzzed. Renata. Team's in position. Weston's attorney contacted us 7 minutes ago. Weston is aware. Which meant Weston knew what was coming and had 7 minutes to decide what to do about it. Which was, in its own way, the final move. You didn't give a man like Graham Weston time to run, because running was an admission, and an admission on record before the board meeting began was worth more than anything that could be said inside the room. At 1:58, Ethan took the elevator to 44. The boardroom was a large rectangular room with windows on 2 sides, and a table that seated 20 and currently had 11 people around it. 9 board members, Claire in a chair along the wall, and a man Ethan didn't recognize who was sitting apart from everyone else and had the specific stillness of someone who had come to this room because they had to, not because they wanted to. Late 50s, heavy set, with the look of a man who had spent the last 12 hours making decisions about how the next part of his life was going to go. Ethan placed him before he sat down, then placed him again when the man's eyes met his briefly and looked away. Former mercenary. The posture was unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. He found a chair along the wall near Claire. She glanced at him when he sat down, and the glance said, "You're not supposed to be here, and also, I'm glad you are." Graham Weston was at the far end of the table, 70 years old, silver-haired, with the groomed, solid look of a man who had spent 2 decades being the most trustworthy person in every room. He looked, when Ethan found him across the table, exactly like what he'd always looked like. A reliable senior statesman of the corporate world, the kind of man you'd want in your corner. He also looked, very slightly, like a man who knew the room was closing. Sienna walked in at exactly 2 o'clock. She was wearing a dark blazer and looked like she hadn't slept enough, which was accurate, and also like she had decided what she was here to do and had been decided for long enough that the decision was in her bones now. She sat at the head of the table. She set a single folder in front of her and didn't open it. She looked around the room. Her eyes stopped briefly on Ethan. He gave nothing back. No nod, no acknowledgement. This was her room. "I'm going to say some things this afternoon," she said, "that are going to be uncomfortable. Some of them are going to be legally significant, and some of them are going to be about me and what I got wrong, and I need everyone here to understand that I'm saying them because they're true, and not because I've been advised to." She paused. "We'll start with the truth, and we'll figure out the rest from there." She opened the folder. She didn't look at Weston across the table. Not yet. 4 years ago, she said, I received a warning. It came through our compliance line, which means someone inside the system, or someone who knew our system, tried to stop what was about to happen. I ignored it. She paused. That is on me. Fully. I had reasons. Some of them were reasonable reasons. But they were also convenient reasons, and I've spent the last week understanding the difference. The boardroom was very quiet. Outside, the Chicago River moved through its channel below, indifferent, the way rivers are. She turned to the folder, and she began. What followed was 40 minutes of the most controlled, precise, and personally costly presentation Ethan had ever watched a person give. She walked through the shell company network, the vendor contract structure, the flow of funds. She presented the financial documentation in the order that Claire had organized it, which was the order that made the conspiracy most legible. She presented the communications from the Pilsen facility. She presented Reyes's statement, summarized by Claire with its formal evidentiary status intact. And when she got to the part about the anonymous warning, she set down the papers. The person who sent that warning, she said, did so at risk to themselves. They had information from a previous failed investigation that suggested Meridian was not what it presented itself to be. They used the channel our company provided for exactly that kind of concern. She paused. I dismissed it. And for 4 years, the consequences of that dismissal compounded inside this company, inside the lives of everyone who works here, and inside the finances of the clients and government entities that trusted us. She looked around the table. That is what I came here to say, before anything else, before any of the procedural steps that follow. Because the people in this building deserve to hear it from me directly. She looked at Graham Weston. He looked back at her. His expression was controlled, the expression of a man who has been in difficult rooms for 40 years and knows how to look like the expression is costing him nothing. Graham, she said, the federal investigators outside this building are going to come in now. She nodded to Claire. Claire opened the door. Renata Voss walked in with 2 agents behind her. She carried a leather folder and moved through the boardroom with the efficient, unhurried confidence of someone who has done this before and knows exactly where the work begins and where the performance ends. She stopped at the end of the table. She looked at Graham Weston. Mr. Weston, she said, I'm Special Agent Renata Voss, Department of Justice. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, and obstruction of justice. I'd like you to come with me, please. The room didn't erupt. It went very still. The boardroom still of people who are processing something that is simultaneously expected and shocking, the way certain truths are when they finally arrive. Weston sat for a moment. He looked at the table in front of him. Then he looked at Sienna. You should have taken the deal I offered your father, he said. His voice was quiet. When he had his stroke, I told him the company was too big for you. Sienna looked at him steadily. And yet here we are, she said. Weston stood. He didn't argue. He didn't perform. He walked with Renata's agents toward the door with the stiff, particular dignity of a man who is very angry and has decided that the only thing he has left to protect is his composure. He passed Ethan without looking at him. The man with the stillness, the former mercenary commander, stood up when Weston was out of the room and crossed to where Renata was standing and said something quietly. She nodded. A second agent positioned himself near the man, not restraining him, just present. The choreography of a witness, not a suspect. The room breathed. Sienna set her hands flat on the table in front of her, and he could see from where he sat that they were shaking very slightly. Not from fear, from the release of something that had been held very tight for a very long time. The board member directly to her left, a woman in her 70s named Patricia Osei, who Ethan later learned had been the one dissenting voice on the Meridian acquisition 4 years ago, leaned over and said, quietly enough that it was barely audible across the room, "That took courage, Sienna." Sienna looked at her. She didn't say anything, but something in her face shifted. Not relief, not vindication, just the simple and difficult thing of being seen clearly by someone who was in a position to see you. Ethan stood up from his chair along the wall. He was done here. He walked to the door. He was almost through it when Sienna's voice reached him. "Ethan." He turned. She was still at the head of the table, hands flat on the surface, looking at him across the length of the room. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. "I went down 44 floors in the elevator and walked through the marble lobby and through the glass doors onto South Wacker Drive, where the October air had gone cold and clean, and the river caught the afternoon light in pieces and threw it in every direction." He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the city settle around him. Then he got in his truck and drove to North Elston, because the F-250's fuel line issue was still waiting, and the owner needed the truck back by end of day, and the work had a shape and a weight and a set of requirements that he understood completely, and right now that was exactly what he needed. The F-250's fuel line took 2 hours. It was straightforward work once he got into it, a cracked fuel return line that had been weeping slowly for long enough to explain the owner's complaint about intermittent power loss on the highway. Ethan replaced the line, checked the connectors, ran the engine for 15 minutes, and listened to it the way he always listened to engines at the end of a job, which was with the complete and unhurried attention of someone who understood that machines, like people, told you the truth if you were quiet enough to hear it. The engine was fine. He called the owner, a retired postal worker named Gus, who lived 3 blocks away and had been bringing vehicles to Ethan for 4 years. Gus came and picked up the truck at 6, shook Ethan's hand with both of his the way he always did, and drove away satisfied. Ethan locked the garage. He stood in the empty bay for a moment in the specific silence of a workday ending, the smell of oil and metal and cold concrete, the fluorescent light humming overhead, the street sounds coming in muffled from outside. He'd stood in this silence hundreds of times. It was a silence he'd chosen, deliberately and without apology, over a different life, over the career that Renata had told him he was throwing away, over the version of himself that colleagues and commanders had expected him to become. He didn't regret it. That was the thing he'd spent a long time making sure was actually true, and not just a story. He told himself, and he'd arrived, somewhere around Ava's 8th birthday, at the honest conclusion that it was actually true. The garage was real. The work was real. Ava's soccer cleats on the wrong side of the room every single day of his life was real in the particular and irreplaceable way that only the specific and unspectacular facts of your actual life can be. He went home. Well, the weeks that followed moved in 2 registers simultaneously, which was disorienting in the way that most things are when the significant and the ordinary insist on occurring at the same time. In the significant register, Graham Weston was formally charged on 11 federal counts. Daniel Reyes entered into a cooperation agreement with the DOJ and began providing testimony that, according to the careful and deliberately vague updates that Renata occasionally sent to Ethan's phone, was expanding the scope of the investigation into territories that had apparently surprised even Renata, which was not easy to do. The name Reyes had referenced, the one above Weston in the domestic structure, belonged to a man who had been, for the past 9 years, a senior partner in a private equity firm with offices in 4 cities and a client list that included 3 state pension funds. That information became public 6 weeks after the boardroom, when the indictments were unsealed, and the financial news covered it with the frenzied energy of people who cannot believe they missed something sitting this plainly in the open, which is the energy that always comes after, never before. The 2 foreign parties that Reyes had referenced were the subject of an ongoing international inquiry that Renata told Ethan, in one of her terse and factual texts, would take considerably longer to resolve and would involve agencies he didn't need to know about. He didn't push it. Some things resolve on their own timeline, regardless of who needs them to move faster. The fabricated financial record, the $2 million in an account bearing Ethan's name, was formally withdrawn from the federal case file 41 days after the boardroom, following a DOJ determination that it had been inserted using compromised credentials and fabricated transaction data drawn from Ethan's sealed military service record. A letter confirming this was sent to the same address on North Elston, where Ethan kept his invoices and Ava's school permission slips, and the things he wasn't ready to throw away. He read the letter once, folded it, and put it in the drawer. He didn't spend a lot of time on it. The fabrication had been designed to make him feel like a man whose history had been stolen, and the honest truth was that the only way to defeat that feeling was to keep being the man whose history it actually was, which meant fixing fuel lines and covering soccer practice and making sure the community college teacher got a fair rate on her Lincoln Continental. He did all of those things. In the ordinary register, Ava went on the field trip to the Natural History Museum and came home with a level of enthusiasm about prehistoric mammals that was, in Ethan's private assessment, both completely unexpected and entirely consistent with who she was. She gave him a 15-minute account of the megalodon exhibit over dinner that was more detailed and better organized than most briefings he'd received from professional intelligence analysts, and he listened to every word of it and asked follow-up questions that were genuine, because the questions were actually interesting to him, and Ava looked at him the way she occasionally did, with the slightly suspicious pleasure of a child who has caught a parent being authentically interested rather than performing interest, and said, "You actually care about this." "Yeah," he said, "I actually do." She seemed satisfied with that, in the way that 11-year-olds are satisfied when adults turn out to be more interesting than the adult's default presentation suggests. He signed the field trip form. He signed the ones after it, too. Sienna called him on a Thursday morning 6 weeks after the boardroom while he was writing an invoice. "The independent investigation concluded," she said. He set down the pen. "And?" "No evidence of personal participation in the fraud. The investigator's report confirms that my decisions during the Meridian acquisition period were negligent in the specific sense of choosing convenience over due diligence, but not criminal." A pause. "They use the word negligent in the official report. I asked them not to soften it." "I know," he said. "Claire told me." A brief pause on her end. "You've been talking to Claire." "She updates me occasionally. She seems to feel responsible for things that aren't her responsibility." "She's been doing that for 30 years, Sienna said. "It's not a flaw, it's a load-bearing feature." Another pause. "The board voted to reinstate me as CEO, pending the independent investigation outcome, which we now have." Her voice was careful in the way of someone describing something they haven't entirely processed yet. "Patricia Osei called me this morning. She's been appointed interim board chair while we restructure. She said—" Sienna stopped. "She said my grandfather would have handled it the same way." Ethan didn't say anything. "I don't know if that's true," Sienna said. "I didn't know my grandfather well enough to know what he would have done. But it meant something, coming from her." "What are you going to do first?" he said. "Going back in?" She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her thinking, not the performed pause of someone constructing an answer, but the actual pause of someone who has spent weeks with a question and is now reading back what they've found. "There are 63 employees who filed internal complaints about Meridian's personnel practices over the past 4 years," she said. "Complaints that were routed through Meridian's own HR system and disappeared. People who raised concerns about things they'd seen or experienced and were told the concerns had been reviewed and closed." A pause. "I'm meeting with all 63 of them individually, starting next week. No HR present, no legal team in the room, just me and whoever wants to talk." She paused again. "It's going to take a long time." "Yeah," he said, "and we're restructuring the compliance system completely. External oversight, independent reporting channel that doesn't run through any internal security infrastructure." A pause. "Claire's building the new framework. I told her to make it bulletproof, and she said she'd make it better than that. She'd make it annoying enough that anyone trying to circumvent it would give up out of frustration." He smiled at that. "The company isn't fixed," Sienna said. "It's going to take a long time to be something I can be genuinely proud of again. Maybe it never gets all the way back." Her voice was honest in the specific way of someone who has stopped needing the answer to be comfortable. "But it's moving in the right direction, and I know what direction that is now in a way I didn't before." A pause. "I know what the warning signs look like. I know what I was willing to ignore and why. It's not nothing." "No," Ethan said. "It's not nothing." A pause. "The government offered you something," she said. "Renata told me, a task force position." Ethan had been waiting for her to bring that up. Renata had called him 5 weeks ago with the offer. A formal appointment as a civilian consultant to a newly formed federal task force on corporate fraud and criminal network infiltration, drawing on his specific operational background and his direct involvement in the Sterling Dynamics case. The position was well compensated, carried significant federal authority, and would have put him back inside the world he'd left 7 years ago, this time on the side of the table where the investigations happened, rather than the operations. "I turned it down," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to ask why." He thought about how to answer that. There was the simple version and the true version, and they were mostly the same thing. "Ava has a soccer tournament in March," he said. "And there's a woman down the street who teaches remedial English at the community college, and her Lincoln Continental is going to need a transmission rebuild by spring, and she can't afford what that actually costs." He paused. "And I spent a long time being very good at something that required me to not be in any particular place for any particular person. I'm done with that." Sienna was quiet for a long moment. "What did you say yes to?" she said. "Claire called me 3 weeks ago." She's building the new compliance framework for Sterling. She asked if I'd be willing to serve as an independent ethics advisor, outside the company structure, not an employee, just someone she can call when she needs a second opinion on whether a system has holes that someone's going to try to use. He paused. It pays less than the federal position. The hours are flexible. I can do most of it by phone. She didn't tell me, Sienna said. She might have been waiting to see if I'd actually say yes. Did you? Yeah, he said. I did. Another pause. Longer this time. He heard the sound of her breathing and the ambient noise of wherever she was. An office, a window, the same city they were both sitting in 17 minutes apart by highway. Ethan, she said, I want to ask you something. Okay. And I want you to know that whatever the answer is, it doesn't change anything about the working relationship, or my respect for what you did, or any of that. A pause. I just want to ask it honestly because I've been thinking about it for a while and I think that's better than not asking. He waited. Would you want to have dinner sometime? She said. Not as a debrief or a work conversation. Just dinner. He looked at the invoice he'd been writing. The name on it was a regular customer who'd been coming to the garage for 3 years and who always brought a container of homemade tamales in December because she'd once mentioned offhandedly that it was his daughter's favorite food and she'd remembered. He thought about the things that had actually lasted in his life, not the things that had been significant or impressive or professionally consequential, but the things that had lasted. Ava's field trip form in the drawer, Mrs. Pacheco's handwriting on a note left on the counter, the particular satisfaction of an engine running clean after you've fixed the thing that was wrong with it. He thought about a woman who had been handed 640 million reasons to spend the rest of her professional life in a defensive crouch and had chosen instead to sit in front of 63 people individually and listen to what they'd been told to be quiet about. Yeah, he said. I'd like that. He heard her breathe out, the specific sound of something that has been held carefully for a while being set down. Friday? She said. Friday works. I'll need to be done by 9. Ava has an early soccer practice Saturday morning. Of course, she said. And then, what is she like, Ava? I want to make a reservation somewhere she'd approve of, if she's the kind of person who has opinions about restaurants. He laughed. She has opinions about everything, but you're not bringing her on Friday. I know, I'd like to know. He thought about it. She likes places with real tablecloths and no TVs. She says it means the food has to be good enough to be the point. A pause, and then Sienna laughed, a real one, unguarded, the kind that doesn't perform anything. She sounds like someone I'd like to meet, she said. She is, Ethan said. She's the best person I know. There is something that people who have been through difficult things, real ones, not the manufactured difficulties of ordinary friction, but the kind that leave a mark, tend to understand about the relationship between what breaks you and what you become on the other side of it. It is not that the breaking was necessary, that framing is too clean, too convenient, too eager to assign meaning to damage in a way that lets the damage off the hook. Graham Weston destroyed the financial lives of hundreds of people who had nothing to do with any decision he made, and there is no angle from which that constitutes a useful lesson for anyone. The employees who filed complaints that disappeared into Meridian's HR system and waited years to be heard did not need that experience to become who they were. The 7-year-old operation that collapsed because witnesses were afraid did not need to fail in order to ultimately succeed. Things break. And then you either find a way to keep going or you don't, and the finding is not graceful, and it's rarely the story you would have written for yourself if you'd had the choice. Ethan Calloway had not planned any part of what his life had become. He had not planned to leave the military, had not planned to raise a daughter alone, had not planned to run a tow truck and repair business out of a 2-bay garage on North Elston, had not planned to walk into a coffee shop on a Tuesday morning and find himself standing between a bully and a young woman who worked behind a counter and had nowhere else to be. He had done all of those things because they were what was in front of him at the moment he arrived, and because he was the kind of person who, when something was in front of him that needed doing, did it. How was not, by any measure, he would have accepted himself, a hero. He was a man who had been good at a dangerous job and had chosen to stop doing it for reasons that mattered more than the job. He was a man who fixed things that were broken and charged a fair rate and occasionally undercharged a community college teacher, because fairness, in practice, is more complicated than a consistent formula. He was a man who had been alone for 5 years and had made a life inside that aloneness that was real and sufficient and his, and who was now cautiously and without agenda allowing the possibility that sufficient and real could also make room for something new without either of them having to become something else to do it. That was not a small thing. It looked like one, from the outside. A dinner on a Friday. 2 people in a city of 3 million, in a restaurant with tablecloths and no televisions, having a conversation that was not about federal investigations or corporate fraud or the architecture of criminal networks. It looked from the outside like nothing in particular. From the inside, it was the kind of thing that you build very carefully, with people who have already seen you at your worst and most complicated and most wrong, because those are the only people worth building with. So, the night before that first dinner, Ethan was in the garage at 8 o'clock, finishing the paperwork he'd been ignoring for 2 weeks. Invoices, a supplier order, the quarterly tax filing that his accountant had sent him a third reminder about, when his phone buzzed. "Renata," he answered. "The 7-year-old operation," she said without preamble. "The one that failed, the witnesses that went quiet." "Yeah." "The file has been officially reopened. Expanded scope, new jurisdiction, joint task force." A pause. "3 of the individuals who originally declined to testify have agreed to reconsider. 2 of them cited the Sterling Dynamics case as the reason." Another pause, and her voice shifted slightly. The precise, evidence-based delivery softening just enough to let something through. "The people who got left behind when that case closed, the ones who lost things because they'd talked, their names are going to be in the record now. Officially. As cooperating witnesses rather than as people who were afraid." She paused. "I thought you'd want to know." Ethan sat at the desk in the back of his garage, with the supplier order in one hand and the phone in the other, and looked at the opposite wall where Ava had once, at age 7, drawn a picture of the 2 of them standing in front of the garage in crayon, and insisted that he hang it up, and where it had been hanging ever since, faded a little now, but still legible. A tall stick figure and a smaller one, side by side, with the garage in green crayon behind them and a yellow sun in the corner. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "Don't thank me," Renata said. "You did the work." "So did you." A pause. "Yeah," she said. "We did." She hung up. He sat for a moment. The thing about the 7-year-old failure. The thing he'd never said to anyone, not to Renata, not to Sienna, not to any version of himself that he'd examined in the 5 years since Rachel died and left him with a daughter and a garage and the unstructured space of a life that had to be rebuilt from its elements, was that he had never entirely forgiven himself for leaving it, for walking away from the failed operation and the scared witnesses and the people who went to prison for things that were not crimes while the people who committed the actual crimes went home to their actual lives. He'd left because Ava needed him. That was true. That was the whole truth, and he had never doubted it for a single moment. But the other true thing, the one that lived underneath the first one, was that the operation had failed partly because the people running it had been too visible, too official, too easy to identify and neutralize, and that a man who had walked away and become, to all appearances, a tow truck driver on North Elston, a man whose name no longer appeared in any active database, whose professional existence had been quietly folded back into civilian life, was, in the specific and unplanned way that life arranges these things, exactly positioned to do what an official investigator could not. He hadn't planned that either. He'd just been in a coffee shop on a Tuesday, minding his own business, and a woman had thrown herself into a situation that happened to be his situation too, and he'd done what was in front of him to do. That was the whole story. There was no lesson in it that was worth stating directly, because the lessons that are worth keeping are the ones that resist being stated, the ones that live in the specific details of specific choices made by specific people who were imperfect and scared and wrong about some things, and right about others, and who kept going anyway because the alternative was to stop. Don't stop. That was the only version of wisdom that had ever actually held up in his experience, across every context he'd tested it in. When you're wrong, admit it and keep going. When you're afraid, feel it and keep going. When someone tries to erase your history and replace it with a convenient lie, know your own history well enough that the lie can't find purchase, and keep going. He turned off the garage lights. He drove home through Chicago at 8:30 on a Thursday evening, through the grid of streets that he knew the way he knew the inside of an engine, not as a map, but as a thing he had moved through so many times that the knowledge was physical, in his hands and his body rather than just his head. He stopped at a red light on Armitage and watched a family of 4 cross the street. 2 parents, 2 small kids, one of the kids insisting on jumping over every painted stripe on the crosswalk, while the other watched with the specific expression of a sibling calculating whether this was worth joining or worth ignoring. The light changed. He drove home. Ava was awake when he got there, which was technically past her bedtime on a school night, but she had reached the age where the bedtime was more of a starting position than a fixed point, and he decided somewhere in the last year that the negotiation was better than the enforcement, provided the negotiation had a limit. She was at the kitchen table with a book, a non-fiction book about deep-sea creatures, because the Megalodon exhibit had apparently been the beginning of a broader interest rather than a standalone enthusiasm. She looked up when he came in. "You're late," she said. "Paperwork," he said. "You always say that." "It's always true." She looked at him with the particular assessment that children deploy on adults they know well, the reading of small signals that the adult doesn't realize they're broadcasting. "You seem different," she said. "Different how?" She considered this with genuine seriousness. "Like when you finish fixing something that was hard," she said. "You get kind of quiet, but it's a good quiet." He looked at his daughter, 11 years old, with Rachel's hairline and his stubborn jaw, and a mind that moved through the world with a curiosity and precision that neither of them could fully account for. She was, by any honest measure, the best thing he had ever done. Not because he had made her, that was biology, not achievement, but because he had shown up every day for 6 years without her mother, and she had become this person, and he had been there to see it. "I finished something today," he said. "Yeah." "What?" "A long project," he said. "It took a while." She nodded, accepting this. "Was it good?" "Yeah," he said. "It was good." She went back to her book. He made himself a sandwich and sat across from her and ate it, and they sat in the kitchen together in the easy quiet that had taken years to build. The quiet of 2 people who know each other well enough that silence is not a gap to be filled, but a thing that holds its own weight. "Dad?" Ava said, not looking up from the book. "Yeah." "The anglerfish makes its own light," she said, "in the deepest part of the ocean where there's no light at all. It just makes it, out of nothing." She looked up. "Isn't that something?" He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "That's really something." She went back to the book. He finished his sandwich. Outside, the October wind came off Lake Michigan and moved through the streets of Chicago the way it always did at this time of year, with a cold, declarative authority that announced the end of one season and the beginning of another, not asking permission, not apologizing, just arriving and being what it was. The city absorbed it, as cities do. And in a 2-bay garage on North Elston, the lights were off and the paperwork was filed and the next job was waiting in the morning, and that was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. For a man who had learned the hard way that enough genuinely meant is one of the most solid things there is to stand on. He cleared the table. He told Ava it was time. She dog-eared her page, which he'd told her not to do 100 times, and closed the book, and went upstairs without argument, which was unusual enough that he noted it without mentioning it. He turned off the kitchen light. He stood in the dark for a moment, in the house that was his, in the city that was his, in the life that was his, imperfect and marked and more than sufficient. Then he went upstairs too.